Medieval developments, legal, political, and cultural changes. Legal and political changes. Highlight. Parliament emerged from the King's Council of Advisers, which included nobles and church leaders. In 1215, King John was compelled by nobles to accept the Magna Carta, marking the notion that even the king was subject to the law. The Magna Carta safeguarded noble rights, restricted the king's tax and lawmaking authority, and mandated noble participation in decisions. Parliament expanded, comprising the House of Lords, nobles and bishops, and the House of Commons, knights and urban residents. In the Middle Ages, Parliament began to develop into the institution it is today. Its origins can be traced to the King's Council of Advisers, which included important noblemen and the leaders of the church. There were few formal limits to the king's power until 1215. In that year, King John was forced by his noblemen to agree to a number of demands. The result was a Charter of Rights called the Magna Carta, which means the Great Charter. The Magna Carta established the idea that even the king was subject to the law. It protected the rights of the nobility and restricted the king's power to collect taxes or to make or change laws. In future, the king would need to involve his noblemen in decisions. In England, parliaments were called for the king to consult his nobles, particularly when the king needed to raise money. The numbers attending parliament increased and two separate parts, known as houses, were established. The nobility, great landowners, and bishops sat in the House of Lords. Knights, who were usually smaller landowners, and wealthy people from towns and cities were elected to sit in the House of Commons. Only a small part of the population was able to join in electing the members of the Commons. A similar parliament developed in Scotland. It had three houses, called estates: the Lords, the Commons and the clergy. This was also a time of development in the legal system. The principle that judges are independent of the government began to be established. In England, judges developed common law by a process of precedents and tradition. In Scotland, the legal system developed slightly differently and laws were codified. Distinct identity. Highlight. The Middle Ages fostered a national culture and identity. Norman French spoken by the king and nobles merged with Anglo-Saxon spoken by peasants to form English. Modern English contains words from both languages, example, park from Norman French and apple from Anglo-Saxon. Official documents in England were written in English by 1400. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in English, depicted pilgrims telling stories on a journey and was among the first books printed by William Caxton. Scotland maintained Gaelic, and the Scots language developed, with poets like John Barber writing in Scots. Architectural changes included the construction of castles, many of which still stand, and grand cathedrals like Lincoln Cathedral. Stained glass windows in cathedrals depicted biblical stories. England became a major trading nation, exporting English wool and attracting skilled workers from abroad. The Middle Ages saw the development of a national culture and identity. After the Norman Conquest, the king and his noblemen had spoken Norman French and the peasants had continued to speak Anglo-Saxon. Gradually these two languages combined to become one English language. Some words in modern English, for example, park and beauty, are based on Norman French words. Others, for example, apple, cow, and summer, are based on Anglo-Saxon words. In modern English there are often words with very similar meanings, one from French and one from Anglo-Saxon. Demand, French, and ask, Anglo-Saxon, are examples. By 1400, in England, official documents were being written in English, and English had become the preferred language of the royal court and parliament. In the years leading up to 1400, Geoffrey Chaucer wrote a series of poems in English about a group of people going to Canterbury on a pilgrimage. The people decided to tell each other stories on the journey, and the poems describe the travelers and some of the stories they told. This collection of poems is called the Canterbury Tales. It was one of the first books to be printed by William Caxton, the first person in England to print books using a printing press. Many of the stories are still popular. Some have been made into plays and television programs. In Scotland, many people continue to speak Gaelic and the Scots language also developed. A number of poets began to write in the Scots language. One example is John Barber, who wrote the Bruce about the Battle of Bannockburn. The Middle Ages also saw a change in the type of buildings in Britain. Castles were built in many places in Britain and Ireland, partly for defence. Today many are in ruins, although some, such as Windsor and Edinburgh, are still in use. Great cathedrals, for example, Lincoln Cathedral, were also built, and many of these are still used for worship. Several of the cathedrals had windows of stained glass, telling stories about the Bible and Christian saints. The glass in York Minster is a famous example. During this period, England was an important trading nation. English wool became a very important export. People came to England from abroad to trade and also to work. Many had special skills, such as weavers from France, engineers from Germany, glass manufacturers from Italy and canal builders from Holland.